Hey everybody, John the Other here, obviously. Now, you likely know that I am not the greatest of fans of Black Lives Matter for a variety of reasons, some of which are that the claim Black Lives Matter is not actually believed in by the people advocating it. We can tell that because they are murdering one another and not addressing that. They're focusing instead on the much smaller fraction of murders which are done by the police. They're not addressing the destruction of the black family, which leaves the children of welfare-assisted families who are divided, financially incentive division of the family, splitting up of the parents, and thus creating damaged children who continue to need to be recipients of the welfare state, who continue to have dysfunctional life problems, and you create an endless cycle of dependence. None of that is being addressed by Black Lives Matter. No. We're just going to look at none of these causes, only the result. And so it's pretty evident that Black lives do not matter to Black Lives Matter. But that's not the thrust of today's discussion. I want to talk about the calls for reparations for slavery. Now, this particular argument has existed in public discourse as long as I can remember being alive, 40 years or more. And it's always been a fringe idea, but obviously the whole thing is going mainstream now, so it needs to be talked about. And there's some problems with it. There's some very serious problems with the mainstreaming of the call for reparations. Now, before any social justice warrior, Antifa, Black Lives Matter ding-dongs start piping up in the comments thread here that I am a white supremacist and I want to, propagate and continue racism or systematic white supremacy or any kind of systematic long-term injustice because of my privilege or my maleness or my whiteness or any of that stuff, that kind of an argument, of which I see all over the place, is beneath my contempt. I'm not going to go point by point and take you apart. The whole argument, sorry for that distraction, everybody else. So a couple of the problems as I see with the call for reparations, the most obvious, the most naked, is that culpability is not heritable. That is, let's just start from a basic assumption for the sake of this argument that the calls for reparations were being made specifically and only against people whose families are known to have participated in the slave trade or owned slaves or anything like that, which isn't the case, by the way. They're not that specific. They're just going, all white people and all black people. But let's get more, case specific and say, let's just say that if your family, like the family of Kamala Harris, the presidential running mate of Joe Biden, family members in the past were slave owners, and therefore we're going to go after your particular family fortune, or if you don't have a family fortune, we're going to garnish your wages for the next 100 years in your children's wages, or we're just going to do a lump sum payment just only to the people who we can actually trace as descended from slaves, and we're going to only tax the people, because we'll do it through taxation, whose ancestors were actually slave owners. Well, then we still have the problem of culpability not being heritable. If my grandfather, let's set aside slavery because I'm a Canadian, we didn't have it here. If my grandfather committed a murder and got away with it, you can't then come and put me in jail for it. That just doesn't work like that. Or I suppose you could, but what you'd be doing would be in no way resembling of justice. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, of course, they're not in any way claiming that we're going to go specifically after the family members of former slave owners, the descendants, and we're only going to compensate the modern descendants of previously known to be owned as slaves. That's not what they're doing. They're just going, well, you're white, and some slave owners in the past were white, and you're black, and some slaves in the past were black. Therefore, that's the Hitler wore pants argument. It's it's beyond stupid. That's like, you're white, a slave owner was white, therefore you're the slave owner. Well, Hitler wore pants, and I can see that you're wearing pants, therefore you're Hitler. Or at least you're guilty of all of Hitler's crimes because you're wearing the same pants as him. That's how stupid that argument is, and it should be dismissed with that level of analysis. It doesn't stand up. And it's wrapped, the fact that that argument is made is a deception. It's not an honest argument because nobody is actually stupid enough to think that logic holds. That's a fraud. So let's clearly identify it as a fraud and move along. The next problem with this whole reparations thing has to start from a question of, why is slavery wrong? Or why is slavery bad? And the answer to that is maybe more subtle than most people think. Oh, because you can't just imprison somebody, you can't just own them. Well, why can't you? Well, what you're just saying, if you can't own someone, what you're saying is you can't enslave them, which is going back to why is slavery bad. And I think the reason is that the individual matters. The individual sovereign, that is, your ownership of yourself, matters. It's a foundation of our civilization. Now, the Marxists of Black Lives Matter are in fact, and the feminists, because they are Marxists and feminists, whether they want to admit to it or not, they are actually going after these foundations. They want to raise Western civilization to the bedrock and create their little utopian ideal in its place, which is, utterly stupid, given the complete and abject failure of communism to produce a utopia. Every single instance that has been tried, it's produced hell on earth. So that's stupid. But getting back to why you can't own a person, why slavery is bad. Sovereignty, the sovereignty of the individual, is a foundation of our culture. It's why there is such a thing as human rights. It's why you can't be arbitrarily imprisoned. It's why it's illegal to shoot you or kill you. It's why sexual violence against people is, verboten. It's a crime. We call it rape or sexual assault. And it comes from actually a religious idea, which is that in the individual, in the singular person, which would be me or maybe you or that guy over there or her, in each person is a spark of the divine. This is a religious idea, but it is one of the foundational ideas of our civilization. It's what so much else is built on top of. And it's the fundamental idea of why slavery is wrong, because the individual, the slave, or the person who we might consider being put in the position of the slave, has their sovereignty, has their spark of the divine, and it is an offense against that, against our basic value, to enslave that person. That's why slavery is wrong. So once we understand that, we have to then recognize what's being demanded when we talk about the demand for reparations. We're talking about, by force, the next generation through a gigantic tax debt. We're going to put on them the requirement to pay something that they had no business in, they had no part in. That's what the call for reparations is to transfer the responsibility for someone else's business onto people, make them pay, which is to say, to enslave them. Failing to recognize the sovereignty of the individual, that goes back to culpability not being transferable. You as an individual, and by the way, the whole a white person or white people enslaved black people, therefore white people are guilty now, again, is a repudiation of this idea of the sovereignty and the singularity of the individual. That each individual is responsible for themselves and not responsible for others. So the call for reparations is a repudiation of the basic idea that caused us as a culture to recognize the wrongness and the crime of slavery. That's why I have a problem with it. And by the way, I'll say one more time, anybody who wants to get into this conversation in the comments thread or anywhere else and say, oh, you just want to preserve your privilege and you want to continue injustices that advantage you, Talk to me like you're a grown-up and put that childish, idiotic garbage away. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, and as always, have a lovely, lovely day.